Hey, everybody, this is Simon Rosenberg of NDN for one of our periodic conversations with people we think are doing really interesting things in politics. And joining us today is a new friend, somebody who we've all known for a long time, Bill Kristol, who has been a thought leader and a staffer in the White House and helped found publications and has just been a political entrepreneur in many ways for a long time. Who I have grown to really admire and respect over the last few years, because he's been a leader of something that I think is just unbelievably difficult, which is that he's been taking on sort of the evolution of MAGA in his own party. He's been part of the Republican crowd that's been trying to challenge MAGA's rise. I know, as somebody who's been working in Democratic politics for 30 years, that doing something like that inside a party is just takes an enormous amount of courage, frankly, and resilience to not just do it once, but to stick with it over time. It's lonely and difficult. And part of what I wanted to do is to let Bill know that we really appreciate, frankly, what he's done and what he's doing, and that he's a friend and he's always got a place at my dinner table here at NDN. And so, Bill, we're really grateful that you're here today. And I think what I just wanted to do is I just want to turn it to you. I mean, talk to us about the journey you've been on. What you think has worked. What are you happy about? What are your concerns? What makes you optimistic? I mean, just help us, talk a little bit about the very specific journey you've been on in the last few years.
Well, thanks. It's good to be with you, Simon, and it's been great getting to know you better the last few years, the last few months and weeks when we've been in sync on sort of understanding what's happening out there, I think, as opposed to maybe the conventional wisdom about a red wave. I guess we can get to that a little later. Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I've been on such an interesting journey. I think the country's been on a very interesting journey, and the Republican Party has been on an interesting but sad journey. And I guess that's the biggest thing. We just step back. We should not lose sight of how amazing it is that what everyone thought of the Republican Party before, and however much one disliked it. People on this call might have disliked aspects of it and thought that there were things lurking in it that weren't being confronted enough. All of that could be true, but it's still remarkable to see this transformation in 7 years really since Trump came down the escalator in Trump Tower. And that's big, and it's bad. I mean, it's bad for the country to have an authoritarian, the two major parties, authoritarian or authoritarian adjacent or authoritarian excusing, nativist, racially bigoted in many ways, know nothing, demagogic, all of that. I won't dwell on that except to say that we shouldn't, it's sort of interesting what countercurrents we can get going and what happens with some swing voters and all, but that's the big picture story. And for me, it has meant that we need, I throw in with the Democrats for all my differences with many of them and doubts and historical differences, because the Democratic Party is the same party. There are parts of it I could, like some policy corrections, and parts of it that are a bit illiberal on the left, but really it's a party that believes in American constitutional democracy in a way that the Republican Party can no longer be said to do in a major way. And that's, again, a very big statement, and not one that I think we would have made about either major party. I would not have made it about the Democratic Party, even when I was a pretty partisan Republican. I don't think I would have, or I shouldn't have, at least back in the 80s or 90s or aughts or 2010s. And partisanship is one thing, but we're now at a point where, for me, it is beyond partisanship. I mean, it's what did Kennedy say? Sometimes your party asks for too much. Well, if your party becomes as I say, an authoritarian or authoritarian justifying demagogic party, so it's Trump, but it's of course Trumpism as well. And so again, that's for me the big picture. And there are moments when one thought one could break it, fight it. I spent most of 2017, 18, even 19, trying to save the Republican Party, help Republicans in Congress stand up to Trump. They weren't very interested in that. Find candidates in 2018 who wouldn't be Trumpy on the Republican side. There weren't very many of them. Get Republicans to support impeachment or the rule of law, or find Republicans to run against Trump in 2019, 2020. Not a lot of interest in that. And so at some point around really early 2020, I thought, okay, you can't, at some point it's beating your head against the wall. I respect those who are still working in the Republican Party to try to make things better. But I think in the short, medium term, it's important to have a healthy and vigorous and victorious Democratic Party. So I was for Biden in 2020. January 6th, I thought, maybe this is the belated wake-up call that finally will sound the alarms. That worked for about 36 hours. I mean, when you think, when a historian writes about this 40 years from now and sees the story of 4 years of Trump, I can sort of see that can be explained by sort of normal incentives and the way partisan politics work and careerism and so forth, and timidity. The post-January 6th Republican Party is a whole different kettle of fish, in my opinion. To not be willing to repudiate Trump, to have Trump now as the most prominent, Republican, the leading candidate for 2024, to have Trumpist candidates winning more often than not in Republican primaries, to have them dominating the discourse of the party 18 months after January 6th, that's really astounding. It's very bad, but it's astounding.
Yeah, I mean, Bill, I've discussed you and many of your colleagues as sort of refugees from a country that are just beginning to realize that you may not be able to go home again. And you've got to sort of make do now with where you are and who you're with. And because I think we all thought that after Trump left, there was a reasonable chance that the Republican Party would go back to something more like a traditional center-right party, and it hasn't happened. And that's why the danger is so much greater now, because it's now the whole party. It's not just one guy, and that has been captured. And what are your?
And for me, Liz Cheney is the epitome of this. There's Liz and I knew each other quite well back 15 years ago, drifted apart and kind of split 2017, 18, when she went along with Trump more than I wished she would. And she was in leadership, and after 2018, and she was, she wasn't Trumpy at all. Well, not at all, but she wasn't too Trumpy, but she wasn't willing to pick fights. And she thought, okay, one term, we'll survive it. She and people like her will remain prominent in the party, and they can put it back together after November 3rd, when she assumed correctly that Trump would lose. I respect that. I didn't agree with it, but I thought that was, it was a plausible thing to think through. It wasn't just a self-justification or timidity or whatever. And to her credit, when she saw November 3rd, both in November and December, and then obviously culminating in January 6th, that Trump was trying to overturn the election, that others were going along with him, that her colleagues, her fellow Republicans in the House were about to vote, 2-1 to overturn the electors. She couldn't take it, and she didn't take it, and she's been extremely outspoken for the last 18 months, and all credit to her. And who else? Adam Kinzinger. I mean, literally two. Romney voted right on impeachment, Sass, and a couple of them have been better than others, obviously, but basically two have really stood up against it over the last 18 months. And at the local and state level, a couple more. But even there, a certain amount of qualifying and sort of hesitation and quietness. So, I mean, for me, that's just astounding. And people talk about Liz correctly now as if she is an outlier. So it's like, oh, what a phenomenon, Liz Cheney. But Liz Cheney, there should be 50, maybe not 150, but there should be 50 House Republicans like Liz Cheney. There should be at least 10 Republican senators like Liz Cheney. There should be people organizing, and that they're not, because the party has gone so Trumpy. And so the only thing to do then, I think, is to go into exile and then to try to help the other party in this country stay sane and win elections.
Well, the Washington Post had a story yesterday that one of your colleagues was quoted in extensively about how there's been an unprecedented number of Republicans around the country, prominent Republicans, endorsing Democrats in this election. They cited Arizona and Nevada and then Michigan and Texas. I mean, do you think what happens with that? I mean, is that an opening, a crack? Is it, and what's interesting to me is I was just out in Las Vegas last week for a speaking engagement, and I spent the afternoon with the Cortez Masto campaign, and Scott Fairchild, who runs that campaign, and I were colleagues and know each other well. And he said that where they've had a lot of endorsements have come from pro-choice Republican women elected officials, in addition to the fears about election denialism and everything else. There's this other sort of cleavage or opening, perhaps. And to you, how meaningful do you think this is? And what should Democrats, how do we approach these politicians about who've crossed over this time? Is there some kind of super alliance that we can strike? Is that too far-fetched? I mean, what are your thoughts?
No, I don't think it's far-fetched. I think it's crucial. And look, it's happened some. I mean, I was Sarah Long when I organized the Republican Voters Against Trump effort in 2020, really, beginning in 2019. got some elected officials, but mostly went right to the voters, did those iPhone, testimonials of, I've been a Republican all my life, but I can't vote for Trump for re-election. People gave their honest reasons why. Sometimes they criticized the Democrats as they gave these reasons, which is why we sort of had to do it. A Democratic group wasn't going to put up ads saying, look, I don't really even like the Democrats much, or I don't agree with them on this issue, or I'm dubious about Biden, but we can't have Trump. In a way, I think we were able to speak to a lot of Republicans because these were honest. They weren't your typical campaign ads that everything's great, the other party couldn't be better. And so I'm proud of what we did. I think the data suggests we helped move. They might have moved on their own. I'm not saying we were crucial, but some 4 or 5, 6% of Republicans in key states might have decided they couldn't vote Republican. They couldn't vote for Trump in 2020. The clearest data, I won't go into the weeds, but the clearest data point on this is in Wisconsin, a state I believe Biden won by 20,000. I think if you add up the contested House seats, they were all contested. Republicans had 50,000 more votes than the Democrats. So it's not even a theoretical thing. I mean, it's an actual fact in real time that there were some, and I've got these numbers probably slightly wrong, but there were tens of thousands of Republicans who voted Republican down ballot and voted for Trump. So I'd say until 2020, a lot of people, both at the leadership level and in the voter world, were sort of, I'm still a Republican, but Trump is an aberration. I do think now it's more like I was a loyal Republican, I'm voting Democratic, and I kind of expect to be voting Democratic for the next few cycles, at least until we get a healthy Republican Party again. That's certainly where I am. And I get the sense from the people doing the videos, testimonials this year, they're all individuals. I haven't talked to most of them personally, so I don't know exactly where they're voting down ballot. And of course, local races are different, and each state is different, and so forth. But I do feel like the Republican Party, it's so entrenched now in 2022 in a way it wasn't obviously in 2018 or 2020, that these people are open. They really are repulsed by the Republicans. And I think they're open to becoming Democrats or Democratic allies. Maybe they won't be Democrats. Maybe they'll be in German politics in our youth. I'm older than you, but in both of our youth, the Christian Democrats often governed in alliance with a group called the Free Democrats, which was kind of a smallish party, kind of free market, actually kind of very pro-American, and they often made up the majority to get the Christian Democrats a majority, which in a parliamentary system, of course, it's different. They had literal coalition government. The Free Democrats often had the foreign minister and so forth. We don't have literal coalition governments in the US, but I think it's not a bad way to think about the next several years in American politics. There needs to be a coalition of pro-democratic forces at the core, the heart of which is the Democratic Party, which stretches all the way from the progressives over to the red dog Democrats. And added to that can be independents and Republicans who can't put up with Trump's party. And as long as the Democrats remain reasonably centrist, as long as they're Joe Biden Democrats, not Bernie Sanders Democrats, to put it straightforwardly, I think a lot of these independents and Republicans are increasingly not just open to, but kind of enthusiastic really about being part of this coalition, because it's the coalition that can really save America. And it's only on a couple of issues that are important to a lot of these. What did Buttigieg call us? Future former Republicans in 2020. He said, I want everyone to vote for me. You remember this? He said, Democrats, independents, it's all short, whatever. And I want Democrats, independents, and future former Republicans. And I used that term for a year or two by myself, but at some point you can't keep saying you're or something. So, but I think former Republicans, particularly on Ukraine, for example, where Biden is a Harry Truman Democrat or a Hubert Humphrey Democrat, he doesn't seem like a McGovern or even Obama, frankly, Democrat in some ways, and it's a little unfair, but or on some of the other major issues where he's not, gone left. I think you look at who knows what the next generation will look like, but if there were a next generation of Democratic leadership that were centrist, internationalist, willing to be sort of reasonably pro-market while also being obviously pro-strong safety net and appropriate parts of the welfare state, the regulatory state, and so forth. I think there'd be a lot of, enough former Republicans and former independents who have leaned Republican in the past to make that a governing coalition. And I think that's what we need for the next few years. And then hopefully at some point, there's an actual conservative party that can come back and be a responsible conservative party. But I don't see that in the very near future.
You raised something that we've discussed before that I think is really interesting, is that if we were in a parliamentary system, there would be a model for how this would work, right? I mean, you're the free Republicans, whatever you're called,
Right.
and Liz
I
Cheney
like that
would get,
term. I'm going
yeah,
to
yeah,
use that term.
free, you
Yeah.
can use it, free
Free,
Republicans.
free Democrats. I think we're the
Yeah,
free Democrats. Right?
free Democrats. And, you know, your Liz Cheney would come in and get a cabinet position, maybe be foreign minister there. You would get a job in the White House, whatever it is. I mean, there would be a way to bring in this group in a formal structural way. And because our system, by the way, people may not know this. I mean, the Democratic and Republican parties exist by statute in the United States. There's actually, we have a legal duopoly, and setting up a third party of any kind is very, very difficult. That's why it's not done very often, because the parties have legal advantages and can spend and raise money in ways that no other organizations can. And so, you know, one of the things that I hope, Bill, we can do is that we as Democrats have to start reimagining ourselves. We have to start reimagining our coalition and to reimagine how we approach all of these matters, because this is new for us, right? I mean, you know, the fact that you and I are on the same team is not something that, you know, we would ever have imagined a decade ago. And I think that we have to be far more creative and more interesting, you know, in order to create this expanded coalition. Because one of the most interesting stats for me in our politics is that since Trump won the nomination, the Republican Party has averaged 46% of the vote in the last 3 elections. That's not enough. And, you know, if we can get our coalition up to 53, 54, 55% of the country, which I think is completely reasonable, right? Over time, we can deny them power, and we also can start winning back some of these state legislatures that have been so gerrymandered that, in essence, you know, you could argue that what happened with the gerrymandering in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan and North Carolina was the beginning of democracy degrading in the United States, right? Where you have these sort of inevitable perpetual majorities regardless of the outcome of the election. And in these elections, I mean, we keep winning in these states, and we have, you know, 35, 40% of the seats in these states. It's just an absurdity for a democracy to be organized like that. And so I do think that we have to think bigger as Democrats about and find, you know, prominent places for you. And we'll see what happens with Liz Cheney and whether she runs in the Republican primary or, you know, decides to sit it out. We'll see what happens. But we've got to get smarter about this. And I'll tell you the one, just for people who are thinking about this, Beto O'Rourke has done a remarkable job in Texas in creating these videos of Republicans speaking the way that Bill has done. I mean, very similar to what Bill has done with, and they're at his events. And so they're clearly not staged, right? I mean, what's important is that there's a level of authenticity about these videos that are incredible. And it's Republicans in Texas saying, I voted for Abbott, or I voted for Cruz, and now I'm voting for Beto. And then they go in and explain why. And it's creating a permission structure, right, for other people who want to leave the Republican Party to say, hey, you know, if he does it, maybe I'll do it too, right? It's the whole psychology of politics, right? Is that you don't want to be alone, you want to be part of a group. And Beto's doing something super, super, you know, both strategically and tactically important, I think, for the Democrats, which you pioneered. He's sort of borrowing your play, you know, playing your playbook, doing it differently than you would have done. But we have to do this on a much more massive scale. We have to create more understanding and awareness that there is this group that needs a home, and that, you know, if you want to join, you're not alone. If the water's warm where Bill Kristol is, right? And we need more of you. And this is really an urgent, I think, sort of strategic task for the Democrats. I don't know that we've done as much as we needed to do this year, to be honest, in this regard. I mean, some of the campaigns have, but it's not been a national project really. But it has to become one, I think, in order for us to prevail, because the goal here is to defeat the Republicans repeatedly so that they walk away from MAGA because they see it as a political loser. You know, that could take a long time, but it's what we have to be committed to do, I think.
No, I think that's, I mean, just three quick, genuinely quick comments. I mean, my colleague Sarah Longwell deserves most of the credit for the videos we did. I mean, permission structure was the term she's been using forever. And she saw quickly when we did a couple of focus groups in 2018-19 that we could have slickly produced ads that made the case for why, if you're a former Republican, you should vote. Narrator could say this: you should be voting not for Trump, but against Trump, and for someone like Biden. But it turned out that the actual videos of these people regular people, fellow Pennsylvanians, fellow Wisconsinites, fellow Georgians, were infinitely more successful. They actually did the slick videos had a bit of a negative effect in the focus groups. Actually, they don't believe them. Who made this? Whose
Right.
agenda really is this? Whereas if I'm John from Reading, Pennsylvania, and I'm pro-life, and so it's a little tough for me to go over to the Democrats, but I just think we cannot afford to have it, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that really spoke to people, and I'm glad that the work campaign, the Fetterman campaign, is doing some of this, and it seems like there's more of that going around. No, I think the party's been pretty hospitable. I actually don't have, some of my peers complain and grouch a little bit. Look, we don't agree on everything. And progressives are also entitled to say, well, these Johnny-come-latelys don't get to tell us we can't do A, B, or C. We need to have a broader, more imaginative discussion, I would say, honestly, both politically and about issues. Because I've been struck now that I follow these internal Democratic debates. There are a lot of them. Well, there are a lot of them. Some of them are better, some are not. Some are sort of standard center versus left, but some of them aren't standard center versus left. And or they could be rethought in certain ways. And so I think that some fresh thinking, the Biden administration has done pretty well in my view, but it's been, kind of a defensive holding operation in certain ways. Between the pandemic, between taking over after Trump and taking over after the pandemic, or not after it, but in the middle of the pandemic, and everything else they've had to do, it's not been a place where you could have expected a huge amount of rethinking, and I'm not even sure I wouldn't have recommended it. They needed to get things going again and reasonably stable and spend some money, and I think they've done a decent job after Afghanistan, which was bad. I think they've done pretty well in foreign policy and so forth. But I do think the next generation of governors, mayors, members of the House, senators, there we could do a little, maybe after this election, there'll be a moment where people can step back and say, okay, we've sort of made it through this. It is time to really think more imaginatively. And some of this will happen in think tanks and other groups like yours and outside groups as well. But I'm struck just having now been, in effect, not in effect, an ally of the Democrats for the last 3 years, really, pretty self-consciously. Well, the gaps are not that great on many of these issues. On some of the, if you're on some of the economic issues, on the foreign policy, there's a lot more overlap than one would have thought when we were busy fighting, the Obamacare as if it were the end of the world, one way or the other, and they were fighting, Republicans as if Bush as if he were the end of the world, and I feel that I think there's a real chance to. People are still a little bit back in the 10 years ago in some of their mindsets, but I think it's a very interesting time, honestly, and can be very hopeful time, also a very dangerous time though, because of the opposition we're facing.
Yeah, and I'll say, Bill, one thing for you to give thought to as you think about this, and for people on this call, is that the Democratic Party is about to go through a really major generational turn. Bernie and Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi are going to be giving way over the next few years. Biden could run again, and we don't really know the time frame for this, but we're in the process of an enormous generational turn. And part of what's going to be interesting about this next crew that's coming is that these issues are going to be central to who they are, and the radicalization of the Republican Party, developing a strategic response to it. These are things that nobody was working on 10 years ago, right? And although I went back and looked, the first magazine piece that I wrote about the dangers of the radicalization of the Republican Party was 10 years ago. Actually, it was in 2012 for a publication called Letras Libres based in Mexico City. But the key thing here is that and you saw it in the I was an advisor of the DCCC in 2018, and what we saw was we had these former national security officials, people who had served in the government in serious positions, decide to run for office as Democrats, and they ran really as patriots. There are people like Abby Spanberger and Alyssa Slotkin, and there's a Mikey Sherrill. There's Jason Crow. There's an incredible new sort of muscular liberal, set of Democrats that are emerging in response to Trumpism. Right? These are all post-Trump Democrats. And I will tell you that in that cycle and working at the DCCC in 2018, I will tell you that the quality of the candidates and the quality of the people that we recruited in 2018, as having been here for 30 years, these were the best people I ever worked with. The emerging Democrats that are coming up, to me, are better than we were in many ways, and are going to be different also. I mean, and some of them are progressive, but a lot of them are just Democrats, right? I mean, that's, you know, and are moderates, liberals, whatever, I mean, whatever the terminology is. And I think that, you know, I'm very excited about the medium and long term for us. I'm very optimistic about it. I think the next few years, and particularly if a series of election deniers, you know, break through, I mean, there's just a numerical reality here, which is they have so many running that we can't stop all of them. It's not, it's just a reality. I mean, some are going to be worse than others, but you know, we're in for a really bumpy period over the next few years. And if you think about it, I mean, Trump is likely to get indicted very soon, and will, you know, which will cause a whole kind of spasm in the right that's going to be, you know, an extraordinary thing to be part of. And so I think I think you're right. I think what you said, Bill, it's really interesting to me just hearing you talk about this, is that we were trying to just sort of right the ship. And we've done that. Biden's done that. I mean, there's some bumps and inflation's too high, and you know, but you know, this issue about making sure that the West and liberal democracy prevails is really the central project for the Democratic Party now, particularly because we got a lot of our agenda passed in this last session, particularly the climate legislation, which was really going to be very transformational, I think, for the world and for the United States. And so I hope that I feel, I'm babbling here a little bit, but I'm personally a little disappointed that we didn't make the preservation of democracy and connecting it to what's happening in Ukraine and connecting it back to here, that we didn't make it more central to our conversation over the last year. I think there was more we could have done to have grounded Americans in the threat, and to have been than we have been. And I think that I have a little bit of regret about that as we head into the election. I think it would have been both something that we were obligated to do, right, to explain to people about sort of the challenges the country faces. But I also think it would have given us more leverage over labeling them as extreme and out of the mainstream than we already have. And we have a lot of tools to do that, but I think we needed more. And because I do think the threat is far more grave than many understand, and we can't shirk having that conversation with the American people. They deserve to know what we know. They deserve to understand what we understand. And this is not secret knowledge sitting in a skiff somewhere. This is stuff that's got to become part of the public discourse. Anyway, sorry for that long.
No, it's very well said, and I remember it's hard to make that central in a off-year election and 435 congressional races and 35 Senate races. It's just they don't lend themselves quite as much to this kind of national conversation. I do think it's very important over the next 2 years. And I'm also like you both. I think things could be incredibly chaotic and dangerous over the next year or two. But also, I'm sort of hopeful, actually, medium long term. I do the urgency of the case for liberal democracy, what's happening in Ukraine and Iran, and how inspiring that is, and what a reminder that is to us of what we both need to do and need to stand for. Maybe 2024 will be little, and some of that stuff's just begun happening, so in a way it probably hasn't had as much effect on the election of 2022. Someone like me, I mean, when I hear Kevin McCarthy say this morning that, well, Republican take the House, very hard to get support for all this funding for Ukraine. For me, that's just by itself a deal breaker. You know what I mean? Are you kidding me? The fight on the front lines of freedom and against brutal war criminal aggression. And the Republican Party, I don't know that they'll be able to cut off the funding with Biden as president, but that's kind of the direction they're going. But it's very revealing. It's very revealing that McCarthy says it without even thinking that this is like a serious moral. Maybe it's in 1940. Of course, this did happen in 1940. So that you say, I was very tied up. We're not really out of the Depression yet, so I'm not sure we can really help the British very much. I mean, that's first things first. That, of course, literally is what America First said in 1940, and it's what the Kevin McCarthy antecedents who went along with America First sort of said in 1940. But it's so revealing that McCarthy doesn't even think that's kind of a shocking or striking thing after everything we've seen over the last 80 years, a striking or shocking thing to say. So again, for me, it brings home the urgency of the situation. The other point I'd make, though, A.B. Stoddard, the journalist, who's a friend, I think, of both of ours, made this point in a very good piece about 2 months ago, and 2023 is going to be crazy. If Republicans win the House, which I'm not convinced they will, but if they win it by narrow margins, the degree of insanity in the House, even if they don't win it, I guess, maybe especially if they don't win it, because then they'll be so frustrated, will be incredible. Trump will be running for president, maybe while being indicted. There'll be other people trying to out-Trump Trump in certain ways or compete with Trump. I mean, the world, or Ukraine, Syria, I mean, Biden may or may not run. Ukraine or Iran. I mean, Biden may or may not run. I mean, we're in a very fluid, we're in trench warfare in our politics. So in a way, people think, well, it is kind of weirdly stable is the word, but it doesn't change that much in some of these states year, election to election. But it's also an extremely fluid and volatile moment. And I think it's all the more reason, therefore, to do what you were talking about before, to really try to put together in a serious, deeper way, the coalition of pro-democratic forces.
Well, and McCarthy, what is just, so comical, frankly, about McCarthy's argument about Ukraine is that we need to be spending that money here at home. And over the last 2 years, the Democrats, the central critique of the Republican Party against us is we spent too much money, right? And that and they voted against all these massive, the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS bill, right? The climate bill. And so we just actually dramatically increased public investment without any of their votes. And so the critique is on its face an absurdity, right? I mean, in addition to it being bad for liberal democracy and abdicating his responsibilities, it's also at its core insane. And it's just so disappointing, but not surprising, right? I guess at the end of the day. Let me do one more thing before we open it up, Bill, which is, we began collaborating on our sense about a common sense that the election was going to be better for Democrats and the Republicans were struggling more. You and I were just talking yesterday. I mean, talk a little bit about, your thoughts about, particularly about sort of the underperformance of Republicans now in Oklahoma, and then Grassley had some bad poll numbers in Iowa. I mean, one of the observations I've had is that there's sort of what I call a MAGA hangover, which is keeping the Republicans under 50 all over the country. It's because they haven't been able to, there are Republicans who just aren't going to go for MAGA, and they've had a hard time, getting up to 49, 50 across the US. I mean, what's your sense of that, and how real is that? Is that wish casting by a Democratic operative here, is hoping that we win both elections? Do you think they have where's their ceiling? Is it 51, 52? Is it 48, 49? What do you think?
I mean, we'll see. And of course, you and I have been through this. Jonathan Last has a good column today. The difference between 51 and 49 is not very great. And it can be driven by flukish events in different states, in different congressional districts, and good luck, bad luck, whatever news there is on October 25th and so forth. And of course, it'll all get overinterpreted. And so one has to hesitate before, this is where so many races are so close that obviously the House in particular is, I think, on a knife's edge, but in the Senate to some degree as well. So on the one hand, I don't know what's going to happen, obviously, in 2 weeks. But I never believed, I said the one thing you and I most agreed on, and this was just based on data in my case, the red wave. I mean, we have an awful lot of younger, I'd say, operatives and journalists who they saw 2010, they saw 2014, they saw 2018, then in reverse for the Democrats. And every off-year election has these waves. And the key to being a smart political analyst is to be a little earlier in seeing the wave, and maybe to even be open to the notion, as happened in 2010 especially, that the wave will be bigger than we think. And so let's look for every piece of evidence we have for it. And I remember looking at the generic ballot way back in February, March. At that point, Republicans were about +3. Biden was sort of 20 points underwater. And I thought, I don't know, if Biden's 20 points underwater and the generics -3, that doesn't really look like a massive wave. It looks like voters are decoupling their judgment of Biden from the parties. It will be a choice election to some degree, not just a referendum. Now, Biden has strengthened, which has also helped things. But I think that it was always going to be, with Trump, with MAGA, with the distinctiveness of the current Republican Party, it was always going to be more of a choice than a referendum. And once it becomes a choice, the country's pretty evenly divided with a slight edge to Democrats, as you said. And if Democrats could succeed in making it that kind of pure choice, the way 2020 was in a sense, they should do okay. Now, there's still some referendum aspects of it, which I'd say is a sort of just, I'm unhappy about this or that, and I'm just going to take it out on the in party, which is why it's Democrats are not going, are why it's a very close election. And there are countervailing forces. You and I discussed this. I'm struck in some of these Great Plains, kind of West, I don't even call them Midwest, Western states, from Oklahoma all the way up to South Dakota. Republicans are just underperforming. They may win most of those. Kristi Noem may win in South Dakota. They may hold the governorship in Oklahoma. They may win Kansas too, a congressional district I'm following. The young Democratic candidate, very attractive guy, Patrick Schmidt's like 2 or 3 points behind. And I think it was a district Trump carried by 11. So there's a lot of evidence, polling evidence, that Democrats are outperforming there. Some evidence the other way in some of these sort of northeastern and actually California exurban districts that are probably trending a little Trumpy, compared the character of the district is outweighing the character of the state in a sense, and some of the sorting is still going on. We're in the middle of a big, resorting in American politics. You and I are old enough to remember Clinton and Gore winning Tennessee and West Virginia, right? And I think Arkansas and Clinton held it. And that wasn't that long ago. So they're conflicting forces. I do think the best way to think about 2020 is there are different things going on. There's revulsion at MAGA, great unhappiness about the overturning of Roe, great unhappiness about the Republican candidates in general, the election denying and the craziness. And there's some unhappiness with the Biden administration, some wish to, some kind of conservatism, you might say, on some issues where the Democrats have either seemed out of step or sort of messed things up a little bit, especially in the first year with Build Back Better and all that. And so you have conflicting trends. That, for me, is the key to understanding this election, which means it's going to be a little confusing, and there'll be some place where Republicans will surprise, maybe, and some place Democrats will surprise. But in general, it strikes me as a very close election. I don't buy the red wave. That's the biggest myth, I think. And you were very early in saying you thought that was a myth. We'll see what happens these next 2-3 weeks. I'm actually modestly optimistic that the late break is to the Democrats, just given everything that I'm seeing out there, some of the early voting that we're just beginning to get a sense of. But, as I say, you could also lose a bunch of races by 0.3%. So you don't want to, be foolish to predict too much either way. Everyone should really, really work hard and get everyone to vote, and especially get young people to vote, and especially get people who are unhappy about the prospects of MAGA Republicans running the House or the Senate or the Senate, get those people to vote in the next 2 or 3 weeks, because it really is important.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I agree with everything you just said. This is a jump ball election, and I do think if it breaks, it's more likely to break for us, and just for a lot of reasons. And I think that I want to just say, because the New York Times poll that came out a few days ago kind of spooked a lot of people. I did a whole thread today on Twitter about this. I mean, we've now had 2 weekly tracks showing no movement towards the Republicans. We've had, there were 8 or 9 other polls that came out at the end of last week showing no movement to the Republicans. I mean, it's possible that, Nate Cohn is a very respected guy, just kind of blew this poll, and it happens, right? And because there's just no other confirming data.
Well, also, there's just a natural distribution. I mean, so the poll was +3, but it was likely, but that gets to the voter screen issue, which is tough to know when you get such an expansion of the electorate in 2018, 2020. It was +1 registered voters. Well, look, if the real electorate right now is +2 or 3 Democratic, you're going to get a +1 Republican poll. That's kind of what margin of error means. That's why you look at a bunch of polls. People do need to take like some elementary statistics courses here to understand it.
Right.
But if a Fox poll comes out the same day that's +3, which is what happened, very well, and that's a well-respected bipartisan proposal. Morning Consult, which has had a pretty good record, I think, and a pretty big sample, is +3 this morning, Democratic and the generic. The Times is +3, Republican likely +1. It's probably very close. Probably it's the actual 538 average is +1 Democratic right now, I think. Feels about right to me. It could open up to +2, in which case Democrats hold the House. It could shrink down to 0, in which case Republicans narrowly win the House, more or less. But yeah, the idea that there's some big trend going on. And I would just finally, I'm sorry to go on about this, but I've talked to some Democratic candidates, some challengers who didn't have that many friends, so they're happy to talk to me. 6 months ago, 8 months ago, attractive younger candidates often. Will Rollins in California, 41, Patrick Schmidt in Kansas 2, some others. Uphill races in Trump districts, Trump carried. And I've seen some of the private polling for them and for others as well. And the private polling is pretty good for Democrats in most of these House races. I've now had 3 different conversations with Democratic consultants who said, I'm pretty worried, it's an off year. I've been through so many off-year elections, it's always rough, blah, blah, blah. So how is it in your district, the candidates whose races you're actually running? I had this conversation yesterday with someone. Oh, pretty good. Actually, we got back a poll that surprised me the other day. It was so good. I'm a little worried that it's like off a little bit because we were actually ahead of where we were in 2020. We were a little ahead of Biden's numbers. But if you look around, so I don't know, I feel like there's a little bit of the Democrats are sort of in some weird, bizarre universe where they can't believe that they could actually do pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll just end with this and I'll open up for questions, is that I talked to the DCCC the afternoon of New York 19, the special, House special, and they said, we're going to lose by three to four. We're okay with that. We think it's competitive. And we won by 2.5. And, they were shocked. And so I do think that Bill said something that's just super important for everybody to recognize, that we had two enormous high turnout elections in a row in 2018 and 2020. It means there's a huge new set of voters. I mean, I found a stat from Catalyst that in 2020, in Nevada, 40% of the people who voted had not voted in the previous presidential election. I mean, it's just a crazy statistic, right? And so we have all these new people in the electorate. I mean, much more so than usual in an expansion. And the Georgia results from yesterday, which are not being replicated across the country. We have to be careful about this. I mean, but in Georgia, they had as many people vote on the first day of early voting. There's my dog, by the way, you may be able to hear, but the first day of early voting as in the general election in 2020, and almost, and which is, I mean, yeah, which is not something anybody would have thought was even possible, right? So the question of whether or not the likely voter screens and all the way they do their magic to sort of figure out who's voting, it's very hard this cycle, right? I mean, midterms are harder because there's more non-voters. And so knowing who's really going to vote, how to really understand that, whether or not, you're, particularly given how young the electorate is and so on. So, there's a lot of art in this as well as science. And so the way I agree with Bill, this is just a really close election. We got to work really hard. And
I mean, we've never had we've never had a post January 6th election, if I can put it this way.
Right.
We've never had an election in recent times where a 49-year Supreme Court precedent was overturned 5-4
Right.
by 3 justices appointed by the most recent Republican president and confirmed on partisan votes by the Senate. We've never had an ex-president like Trump behaving like Trump. So it's very hard to, we just don't know. Those things may all wash out and it looks like a normal off year, but they may not wash out, or they may have very unpredictable effects. And I think most of those unpredictable effects are probably somewhat helpful for the Democrats, but only if Democrats get out there and vote.
Yeah, no, and I'm just, last point is that the thing you just said is so important, is that for when you hear commentators on television and you're reading them and say, well, the traditional midterm dynamics, and it's like, Bill just explained to you, like, we had COVID and ending of Roe and January 6th and the painted orange man and all the other things that we have, right? I mean, this is not like any other election any of us have ever been through in our entire lifetime. And so the notion that somehow these sort of structural dynamics would just automatically be in play, it was always ridiculous. And I'm just amazed that very prominent, respected people are sticking, by the way, they're sticking to that argument. It isn't just they made it a few months ago. And so anyway, Bill, before we take questions, where can people, if they want to read your stuff, stay in touch with you, how do they do that?
Probably the easiest way is just to follow me on Twitter, because I try to use my Twitter feed to link to a lot of things that are published at the Bulwark. That's thebulwark.com, which I'm the editor at large at. But also, so if you follow me at Bill Kristol, I think you'll see most of what I think is worth reading by what I link to.
It's a really good Twitter feed, everybody, by the way. So just definitely follow. Okay. 2 ways to ask questions, and we're going to do this quick because we try to keep these to 45 minutes, but this was such a good one that we've gone a little long. There's a question about Evan McMullin. I just want to bring that up because we didn't talk about it and there was a debate last night, right, with Mike Lee and Evan McMullin. What's your thought about that race?
I think, look, I've seen there was a Deseret News, I think, poll, nonpartisan media poll that had McMullin within 5 of Mike Lee, and McMullin Super PAC, run by my friend Mike Murphy, did a legit poll which had McMullin up. I mean, it's hard to believe, but the Democrats have done exactly what you called on them to do, which is they behaved very responsibly and they don't in a way get enough credit for this, they didn't nominate their own candidate. They let Evan, who had been a Republican prior to 2016, be run as an independent, and they supported him. So it's made it easier for Republicans in Utah to come over to vote for McClellan. The Democrats, I think, are going to turn out for him as well. It's actually an instance in practice of what we were talking about, the kind of coalitional behavior. And as I say, it would have been easy for the Democrats to say, well, he's not going to win anyway. Let's nominate some worthy Democratic, activist who's been laboring the trenches. Where was Evan McClellan all these years? He was working for the CIA and then was a Republican House staffer. But they've done the right thing, and they've gone with Evan, who's a courageous and impressive guy. And he did well in the debate last night against Mike Lee. I really think he has a chance to win. I think Grassley could lose in Iowa, 89 years old. Again, these races aren't always about ideology. They're also about, is this guy really up to representing us? He's in good shape, but until he's 95, it seems. And the opponent is a retired military guy, and so probably get some of those ex-Republican types in Iowa to switch over. So people are, I think those races are two that have been off the radar there, where things could really happen. One list, I'm going on too much, but I do think a lot of my fellow former Republicans complain about things. Sometimes the Democrats do things, progressives do things. You're not making it easy for us to be with you guys. But I will say two things. The Democratic Party in Utah, really a terrific performance by them in terms of stepping aside and letting McClellan have a real shot, which he has. And I think Nancy Pelosi does not get enough credit for doing everything she did to put Liz Cheney front and center at the January 6th committee. And think about that for a minute. You and I have been involved in some of these things inside. How much resistance must there have been to that? Nancy Pelosi has to tell her own members, A, Liz Cheney is going to be on the committee. B, she's going to be vice chair. C, she's going to be the star of the committee. And Adam Schiff and Jamie Raskin, you guys were great. You did the first impeachment. Liz was on the wrong side of that. But you know what? It's for the sake of the country. We need to make her central. And she's very talented and effective and all that. I don't mean to, but Pelosi has been, in this respect, I think, had a grasp of the coalitional possibilities here. I mean, she thought it was the right thing to do, but in a way that very few Democrats have had. And I think that January 6th committee, we don't know what effect that's had, and what effect Liz Cheney has had. But again, I think that could be something that we're not quite appreciating.
I'm very close to the speaker, and as people know about NDN, we have sort of deep connections to California, particularly Northern California. And I think that the January 6th committee may be Nancy's greatest achievement and her great legacy, for all the reasons you just stated. I mean, to have, in this partisan climate, to have pulled that off and to have it had so much integrity, and for it to have been so effective, is just, it's a miracle. I mean, it's literally a miracle. And I think what everyone has to remember is that, even if we lose the House, the work of that committee could be carried on in the Senate. It can be carried on in the federal government. I mean, it's not over if we lose the House. It's just the beginning. It's the foundation. And it was a really, I agree with you, Bill. I think this is a really important point, because we have struggled to talk to the American people about Trump and about who he is and what he's done. And this has created a safe space, in essence, right, to sort of expand the conversation that needed to be had with the American people. And I do think, I agree with you. I often talk about how I've known Nancy before she was speaker, right? And that this may, other than the ACA, and I guess just all the legislation that just passed, I think what she'll be known in the future is, this will have been a powerful tool to have, that we hope will have been part of the effort to save our democracy. And so I think it's, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens with it. I mean, so the reason why, if we keep the House, with that committee can keep working, and maybe in a different form with a different name, but with a similar mission, and that really will matter. Let me just see if I can just cherry pick another question or two. Sorry if I'm not going in order, everybody. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to end here, Bill. I think we've hit our time. My dog is barking, as I feared. I know
it's not too long, but it was a very interesting conversation, and really it's thought-provoking. I hope for me, I hope for other people as well.
Yeah. And any final thoughts? I mean, any hopes, aspirations, anything you just want to put out there before we go?
Short term, I think the better Democrats do, honestly, on November 8th, the better for the country. It's almost, there are a couple of Republicans it's, I think, okay to vote for. Anti-election denial Republicans, there aren't many. Medium term, I think being ready for the next 2 years for tumultuous, challenging, difficult, but also potentially very hopeful 2 years. So I think this is the time to be engaged, I guess. I would say that I like politics and I've been engaged and I am engaged. So I guess but I honestly believe it. This would be a time where you look back, you might regret not having done what you could do at your state level, local level, whatever your business association, labor, whatever your particular place you can make a difference is. I think it's a good time to be engaged. Longer term, there's a real rebuilding and building anew of our liberal democracy and our economy in all kinds of ways. That's a big task, which people also can contribute to in so many different ways.
Yeah, and I'll just end by saying you shouldn't just vote everybody and do the work. You need to vote early. Voting early is really important for a couple of reasons. One is that it makes more Democrats. When you vote early, you allow the campaigns to move on to lower propensity voters and to do GOTV. And so by voting early, you're actually giving the campaigns a tool to increase Democratic turnout. Second is that it just makes our elections run more smoothly in a time when Republicans are playing games. It's just harder to disrupt an election that's where 50-60% of the voters have already voted before election day. So that's also really important. But third, and I think this is really, really important, is that, we have more Democrats, but we have more episodic voters in our party, more people who are new to voting. They haven't yet become regular voters. It's both our great opportunity and our great burden in some ways, because we have to spend a lot of money just getting people to vote, not just to, persuade them to be for us, right? We also have to do this. It costs a lot of money to get low propensity voters to go, or episodic voters to go vote. And when they see, this is classic social science, right? When they see lots of other people voting, they're much more likely to say, hey man, a lot of people are voting, I got to vote too. And so this issue of the bandwagon effect of the early vote putting up big numbers like in Georgia, I've become convinced that this helps create a virtuous cycle of participation in our politics. And what's important is that it's 3 weeks before the election, right? I mean, this is now 3 weeks of building intensity, building stories about people voting. It's an affirmation of our creaky democracy, our democracy that's being challenged every day that you see these kinds of turnouts. Is so affirming. In some ways, it is a daily rejection of the politics of MAGA by all these people turning out. But it also creates this, I think, really powerful dynamic. And it's one of the reasons why we've had such enormous turnout in the last 2 elections, because when we give people the opportunity, we make it easier for people to vote. They do. And when more people vote, then they challenge their colleagues and friends to also vote, right? And it creates this virtuous cycle. So we're in a very different election system than we used to have, where it's now we've made it so easy for people to vote. And so our tactics have to change a little bit. Our communications have to change to help encourage maximum participation. And so, yes, the Georgia numbers are astonishing. They're encouraging. They're affirming. Our democracy is proving to be strong, all run by Republicans, by the way. Raffensperger is, and all those folks, the people that were, who were part of the thing last time are still helping run these elections in Georgia. And so it's just an exciting thing. So just don't vote and give and make calls and door knock. Vote early. It really matters. Bill, thank you. And thanks everybody. And this will be up on our website later this afternoon. If you want to share it with your colleagues and friends to enjoy, and let us know what you think. I mean, Bill and I are on Twitter. You can find us. My DMs are open. I mean, help us. My homework assignment for everybody here is, how does the Democratic Party build this expanded coalition, this new kind of coalition? How do we rethink ourselves in a time of enormous challenge? And I think we have work to do there. And I think our community should help keep this conversation going. So thanks, Bill. Thank you for your courage and your hard work. And thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.